Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Green New York Lunchtime Learning webinar series. I'd like to thank you all for taking your time here today during your lunch hour to learn about a hobby that is near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk about creating a backyard vegetable garden, and I'd like to give a big thanks to Albany Master Gardener John Martin for presenting today. A couple housekeeping tips before we do get started here. Everybody is on mute when you joined. If you do have questions as we go along, please type them into the chat box. We will get to questions at the end, but you can just type them into the chat box. In addition, this webinar is being recorded, just like all of our Lunchtime Learning Series webinars, and you can find the library of all our previous editions on the Green New York website. I will put a link in the chat there. Also, our next month's webinar is going to be on May 10th, and that's going to be on the Climate Smart Communities program, where you'll be able to learn more about what the program is and how your community can participate. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to John here for today's presentation.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining me, or allowing me to join you for your lunchtime presentation. Today we're going to talk about creating a backyard vegetable garden. This is not just for beginners, but everybody can learn a little bit from this. I understand I have a half an hour, and this usually is an hour presentation, so I'll move through it quickly. If you have any questions about a particular slide, we can go back to that. Also, Brandon will be sending you notes that are the details from the presentation, and also a collection of Q&A that I've had over the number of presentations that I've done for this particular topic. So a brief history. Gardening's been around for a long time, various ups and downs, the Middle Ages, and most recently people have taken up, because of the pandemic, you see a large interest in backyard gardening. Not only is it turned into a hobby, but also it helps people provide food for their table where they know where it's coming from. So let's get started. So you're going to want to plant a garden, and let's keep it simple. So the first thing you can do is make a list of what you like to eat. And then you create two columns, buy and grow. Your grow list may include crops that are freshly eaten, lettuce, arugula, leafy greens, things that are easy to produce and are best eaten fresh. Also, you may want to have an expensive or difficult crops to get. For some cases, people that like ethnic foods that you can't find in your local grocery store or local farmer's market, then those are things that you might consider growing. Your buy list should include bulkier crops, cheap, readily available, lower priority buy crops. When I have people tell me they want to start a vegetable garden and they say, oh, I want to grow strawberries, I want to grow cucumbers, I'm going to grow pumpkins and watermelons, the first thing you have to understand is the amount of space these take up. Corn, you need a large number of stalks to get a number of ears. So you got to be considerate of how much space you have, because that will dictate what crops you want to grow. Now you want to plan your garden. You want to grow dependable, easy spring, fall crops, lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, radishes. These are all relatively easy to grow, and they work very well in the spring, and they work very well in the fall. Dependable grow summer crops, which require heat, the peppers, tomatoes, beans, squash, etc. Also under consideration is what your regional soil. Since a lot of people are coming from all over different parts of the state, you want to understand the soil that you have in your region and what your weather will support. And by weather support, when your frost dates are, both are early and late. So you also consider what crops you can store. Tomatoes, you can make sauce and you can put those in your freezer. Beans you can blanch and you can put those in the freezer. So you can always have fresh vegetables late into the season. If you have a cellar, a root cellar, potatoes and carrots go very nicely in the root cellar. You also have to consider available space. That's what I made reference to when I talked about your watermelons or your pumpkins or your strawberries. They send out runners all over your land and make very difficult to get a large production from a number of vines if you have limited space. Different types of gardens. You can have gardens where you'll hold rows where you plant your vegetables in, or you can have a raised bed type of garden. Just for sake. The one on the left was a friend of mine who used to grow his vegetables in a row where he'd hoe in the soil, bring in the soil, and have walk space between. I convinced him he'd do better off with raised beds. So the one you see on the right is his garden transformed into raised beds. You have better control over what you grow. You are able to rotate your crops. And the pots you see up front, he's growing his herbs in. So that makes it very easy to handle and control your garden produce. If you have limited space, you can do things like square foot gardening, where you can put crops that don't require a lot of space between their growth, things like carrots and lettuces, greens, arugula, the cabbage you see in the background there. And you can also grow vertical with trellises. You can grow your beans. So you can get a large amount of produce from a very small area. You also have the case of elevated beds. These are for elderly people or people that are physically challenged where they don't have to bend over, or you can access them from various other wheelchairs or other conditions, so that you can also partake in gardening and creating your vegetable garden. You also can go vertical. If you have fences, you can hang your vegetables from that. You can have trailing vegetables that come down, but they're primarily good for greens and also for herbs. And then if you really want to get elaborate and you have enough light, you can do your kitchen gardens where you put them in the windows or you have artificial light. So these are the different options you have if you're looking to start a garden or you're looking to expand your garden. So now if you're starting your garden or you're looking to increase your garden space and you're not sure where you want to put it, the best idea is look at the available sun, your shade, your moisture, and your soil makeup. This is what we talk about: location, location, location. Same thing if you're buying a house. So you want southerly and westerly exposures. These receive the most sunlight, and these are good for high sugar content plants. By these, I mean the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants. All these require a very warm soil before you can plant them. Some people will run out and get their tomatoes first sign in May, put them in the ground and wonder why they're not growing because the soil temperature is only about 40 or 45 degrees. You really want to have a 60-degree temperature for a lot of these in the soil for them to truly benefit from the nutrients that are in the soil. Your location in your warm areas also requires attention to your moisture. If you're looking to go north and east facing, these sites receive a little less sunlight and provide a cooler environment. So these are better for your leafy greens, your kales, your spinach, your Swiss chard. These will be very receptive to a little cooler area. And also you won't need as much attention to your moisture because they won't be heating up from the sun. Your location impacts your vegetable plants with respect to sunlight. You'll see on some of the vegetable seeds or the packets, or if you do any research about the vegetables before you grow them, some will say they want full sun. Some will say partial sun, and some will say full shade. This isn't, these are recommendations, they're not gospel, but full sun usually means 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. When you see the little sun that's partly dark, partly sun, that's a partial shade, partial sun. Those are usually 3 to 6 hours of sunlight, and they can be associated with root vegetables, your carrots, your onions, your radishes, things along those lines. Full shade means about 3 to 4 hours of sunlight. Those are little circles that you see that are fully darkened in on your seed packets or in your information PDF files when you're researching your vegetables. These are usually associated with your leafy greens, your spinaches, your kales, your lettuces, arugula, things along those lines. Again, these are recommendations, they're not gospel. It doesn't mean you can't put your leafy greens in full sunlight. It just means that you got to take better care of them and they're less likely to last longer. Again, the sunlight exposure also varies during seasonal changes. You can have a sunlight exposure several times a day, and during the different months as the sun moves across the sky and where you are in the state, you have to be aware of what your sunlight changes will be during the season. Also be aware of surrounding trees, houses, fences that may impact your garden sunlight. For instance, if you go out and plant now, which you can do if you're above 40 degrees in your temperature. Your trees, your deciduous trees don't have any leaves in them, so it won't be an indication of what's going to happen with your sunlight as they leaf up during the season. So before getting started, it's best to understand your soil, perform a pH test. These can be done at your local Cornell Cooperative Extension lab. There are Cornell Cooperative Extension labs in every single county in New York State, and you can take a sample into them, and for a small charge, they will provide you with a pH for your soil. They also can provide you with extended soil testing for nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. And if you need to, you can use a fertilizer or organic material to amend your soil, depending upon what you want to plant. You can get a test also from your local box stores, your garden center, but the problem with those is that they will be somewhat accurate and tell you what your pH is or your nutrients, but they won't tell you how much you need to replace it, to amend your soil. Juby, you come and get the cat. Okay, excuse me for that interruption. If you're taking a soil test and you have a number of beds around, you want to take multiple raised beds, take a few samples from each bed, and you combine them all together and bring that in for your sample. So when I talk about matching crops with pH, depending upon your soil or what you need to amend it to, here are some examples of the ranges of the pH that each of the vegetables will best support. If you look at these, you can see that most of them in the range of 6 to 7. So you want to be able to take benefit of the soil conditions when you do your planting. Another important item with this is if you have been gardening for a while and you're putting your plants in the same location, they take the nutrients out of the soil each year. So as it changes, you may need to amend your soil. This is another reason why, even if you're an experienced gardener and been gardening for quite a while, you still want to take a pH test at least every other year to make sure that your nutrients haven't been depleted where it may be detrimental to your plant growth. Water availability. You want to go put your gardens out there, and the main thing you want to be concerned about is providing water to your vegetables. A simple example of this is when I first put my garden in, I thought, okay, I have a water spigot just on the other side of my fence. That should be relatively close and should be perfectly fine. But when I got done with my irrigation system, every season when I had a leak, I had to go all around the house, turn it off, come all the way back, fix the leak, walk all the way around the house, turn it back on, walk all the way back to make sure I had it fixed. I got that remedied when I had my plumber come in and put a spigot right next to my vegetable garden. But the idea is you want to be able to have water availability. And there are some examples in here of irrigation systems that you can set up. The easiest one is the one on the right, where you have a number of trickle hoses that come down. You can put a timer on it, and you can then set your gardens to be watered from the ground up. The time of day and extent of watering is dependent upon your soil, your planting, and your method of watering. Ideally, what you want to do is water your vegetables early in the morning or well before mid-morning, so that the sun doesn't bake the water. And it's best to water them by hand or by soaker hose at the roots rather than putting water on the plants themselves. Okay, so now you want to get planting. You determine the location of your gardens, your cell space, your soil compaction, and your crop selection. So lay out your garden on a piece of paper or the number of beds and decide what and where you want to plant. You can also get a number of websites by just asking the Google machine, and they'll give you a whole host of layouts, and you can pick those that are best suited for what you want to plant. But you also have to make sure that your plants don't shade each other. If you put in climbing pole beans, and once they get fully produced, and they turn out to shade your carrots or your lettuces, then they're not going to grow as well. So the key is to make sure that you have the plants laid out and consider the final height of the plants when you get done with them. If you have containers and raised beds, these tend to warm up sooner in the spring, stay warmer in the fall. So these will help stretch your gardening. If your layout is traditional or square foot gardening, like you saw in the earlier slides where you had them closely packed, or if you had a raised bed garden setup where you had space between and you could handle a lot of different crops, that'll help determine your crop spacing. And again, here's a case where you can have your square foot gardening and your raised beds. And there's a benefit to doing the raised beds, which we'll cover a little bit later. So now you want to establish your growing season. And with different parts of the state, you're going to have different frost dates. You're going to have a last frost date and a first frost date in the fall. And these will dictate your plantings. Ideally, these will be covering your two-season plantings. By two-season plantings, I mean a lot of times your lettuces are good in the spring, and once it gets to the heat of the summer, they'll start to bolt, they'll become very bitter, and you won't be very successful in growing lettuce. So you can plant your lettuce somewhere around the end of April, early May, depending upon your frost date. You can, they'll be good until maybe June. Then you'll have the heat of the summer in July and August, and towards the end of August, when it starts getting a little cooler at night, you can replant your lettuce, and then you'll have lettuce all the way through till October or maybe the first frost. And when I talk about lettuce, I'm talking about all the greens, the mescalines, the arugulas, the spinaches, any of those leafy greens that go very well in salads or as a side for a main dish. So you want to know your temperature requirements for your crop. Number of references provide planting and harvesting for the different zones, and a lot of those are listed in the bibliography that when Brandon sends out your notes, you'll have a copy of the bibliography for you to go reference. So now you've got your crops and your layout, and now the question is, do you want to start them indoors or outdoors? It's still not too late to do some indoor planting, primarily because your tomatoes and your peppers don't really go into the ground until the temperature in the soil is about 60 degrees, and depending upon where you are in state, they may not occur until middle to late May. So if you wanted to start your plants indoors, you can start them, the tomatoes and the peppers and the eggplants now, and they'll germinate and they'll grow, and figure 6 to 8 weeks will put you right about the time you can transplant them outside. Again, planting these is based upon the last frost. You don't want to start in next year. You don't want to start your tomatoes in February, because by the time they're ready to be planted outside, it will be too cold to do that. So you can get the seeds indoors, and depending upon your last frost date, that's when you back it out based upon what's in the seed packet, and you can then determine when you can start them indoors. Starting them indoors, the benefit to that is a greater variety of cultivars. And again, if you're having ethnic vegetables that you wish to grow that you can't find locally, then this is a good opportunity for you to grow these. There's a lot of really good options for seed catalogs that you can find out there. And there's a wealth of information on seed catalogs, and a wealth of information also on the seed packets themselves. So if you're looking to grow indoors, you need some simple grow lights, proper containers, some soil, fertilizer, nutrients, and water requirements. If you go online, you can find some very inexpensive setups for all of these, or you can go to, depending upon how serious you are, you can go to places like Garden Supply and purchase whole setups already. But I would check out on the internet first on how to construct these yourself. Some of them are very simple, just using little PVC pipe to set up an assembly. You can get grow lights from your local big box stores. Okay. So outdoors, seeds, transplants, or both. If you start from seeds, due to delicate root systems, some plants do not transplant well. So this way you want to start them outside. You put them in seeds, you put them in the ground when the temperature is warm enough. The quick germinating crops can be grown from seeds, radishes, beans, peas, and it may be more cost effective. The only problem is they may be susceptible to early weather conditions. In New York State, we're infamous for having a frost when we least expect it. So you want to be careful about that. Also, if you're planting seeds, you want to put a lot of seeds in because not all of them will germinate. And you'll have to require thinning to help airflow and light exposure as they start to grow. Now, the one thing I can tell you, if you're going to thin your plants, do not pull them out. By pulling them out, you disturb the root system of the tender root systems of the plants you wish to save. All you do is take a fine pair of shears or small tweezers and clip them. By clipping them at the ground level, you're not going to cause them to grow anymore, and they're not going to interfere with the plants that you want to grow. If you're starting from transplants, the benefit is that they're mature sooner and they provide harvest earlier. If you're looking for transplants, go to your cooperative extension. They usually have garden sales where they're growing vegetables and flowers and herbs that you can use. You can also go to garden centers. And your last resort would be your big box stores because they mass produce things and you're not sure exactly where they came from or what type of growing conditions they were in. But whatever the case may be, when you get them from the greenhouses, the farmers markets, garden centers, you need to harden them. By hardening, I mean these have been grown in controlled environment. So you bring them, when you bring them home, you set them outside for a couple hours for the first day, you bring them in. Set them outside for 3 or 4 hours the next day, then you bring them in. And you do this for about a week so that they get used to the changes in temperatures, the sunlight that they're not used to growing in their controlled conditions. And if you also have a windy location, you might set them in the windy location so they'll become very sturdy. These are more for things like tomatoes and peppers that are going to be exposed to the wind. So now you want to get started. You have seed starters, you have transplant starters. The direct seeds are on the left, and these will all be in your notes. And your transplants or your indoor starts are on your right. These transplants are the ones that have sturdy root systems. And you also want to plant them when it gets a little bit warmer in your weather condition. The direct seeds you can plant once the temperature in your soil gets to about 40 or 45 degrees. Compatibility of vegetables, as I mentioned to Brandon, we have a whole presentation on companion planting, which tells you what to plant with what. But the main reason is you want to rotate crops from season to season. Particularly, that's why the raised beds work out very nicely because you can plant one set of vegetables in one raised bed. The next year, you move it to the next raised bed. And why do you do this? Because your nutrients, some have heavy feeders and some are light feeders. By that, I mean they require a lot of nutrients that are in your soil. And they'll take that out of the soil. And if you don't replenish it, then they won't do as well. These are the problems I've had. People come to me and said, I had great tomatoes 3 years ago. 2 years ago, they were okay. And last year, they were rotten. And I said, did you do anything to your soil or you're planting in the same place? And they go, no. So you got to be careful about that. Second thing is potential diseases, particularly with squash plants. And squash bugs will come in and you'll have great squash plants at the start. Next thing you know, you turn around 2 days later, they're all dead because you've got squash plant disease, squash bugs. So when you change your plantings, you've got to make sure that if you've had a disease in that particular bed or that particular location, you do not want to plant your same plants there. When you're planting vegetables in close proximity for the square foot garden, you want to refrain from planting competing vegetable families because they have different nutritional needs. By compatible families, and I'll go through this very quickly. You'll have these families are the alliums, which are the onions, leeks, garlics, the brassicas, which are Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower. And you have your pumpkins, your winter and summer squash, zucchinis. Your fruit vegetables are usually tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. Your potted crops, greens, runner beans, peas. Your root vegetables, potatoes, parsnips, carrots, beets, and your salad greens. Most of these families can all be intermingled with each other. I mean, within the root family, for instance, you can plant your parsnips and your carrots and your beets all in one area. Your salad greens, you can keep all in one area. Try not to mix families within your raised beds in a particular area. Your seasonal planting, your first and last frost dates. Again, we talk about cold weather and hot weather planting. The desired vegetables like hot weather, cold weather dictates when you plant them and how you lay out your garden. For companion planting, for instance, if you have tomatoes that are going to be produced later in the season, and you can also put in your radishes around your tomatoes and harvest them before the tomatoes get to full bloom. There's such a thing called the Three Sisters, where they plant beans, squash, and corn all together. So as the corn grows, the beans will grow up the corn stalks and use them as a trellis. They'll provide nutrients to the soil, and the squash plants will propagate around the ground and provide shade for the soil to keep it moist. Those are examples of companion planting. So your spring, summer, and fall plantings. Your cold weather crops are amenable to two plantings, one in early spring, one in early to late fall. And the summers are usually dependent upon the first and last frost, and that all goes back to your soil temperature. So there's additional considerations. There's herb gardens, pest and disease control, composting and fertilizing. Soil are based upon soil testing independent, weeding, pruning, drying, freezing, canning, storing. These are all things that are other considerations that we have presentations that can help you with. So in conclusion, the vegetable gardening can be relaxing and rewarding. Nothing better than a homegrown vegetable. If you had tomatoes from your garden, if you've grown them before, or you have them from a farmer's market, you can taste the difference from what you get in the store. But one piece of advice is to keep a journal, and that is what you did with your soil, when you planted it, seeds and plants and where they were purchased, any diseases and pests that come along, and the amount of vegetables that were produced. You want to keep this over the years because it'll tell you what was successful, what wasn't successful, where you planted what where you got your plants from, and whether or not they were productive, and the amount of vegetables that were produced. Because if you spend a lot of time and you get very little produce out of it, then you may not want to do the same vegetables or the same again. So the journal will be a work in progress over the years, but nothing will beat experience. So again, you have the bibliography that will be sent to you, and I blew through this very quickly. Usually this whole presentation I can drag out for almost 45 minutes because I get into details and a lot of the vegetables that go together, and spending time with the seeds and the transplants and talk about individual vegetables. So I will now turn it back over to Brandon to open it up for questions. And there'll be a Q&A package that Brandon will be sending out to you folks. That there's a collection of questions that were asked throughout the number of presentations that I've done in this particular item. One thing I'd like to mention, that if you go to the, if you go back up here, and you see the Albany CCE Cornell EDU gardening, you go to that website, there's go to the vegetable varieties for gardeners. They have a list of somewhat of 60 or 70 vegetables that are likely to be planted. And if you click on each of those links, then you can also get information about the vegetable itself, when to plant it, the spacing. It also gives you different types of variables that you can encounter. It also allows you the different types of vegetables that are good. A number of tomatoes do very well in different parts of New York State. And these are all determined through the Cornell Cooperative Extension, where they have people like master gardeners will do trial errors or trial gardens where they'll grow different types of vegetables each year and report back on how they do, how well they do, and how productive they are. And they use these as a means of establishing the information that's on that website. So again, that's a very valuable tool. There's also, if you go to the different seed catalogs, some of the seed catalogs will give you a wealth of information, especially if you're a new gardener. One of the best seed catalogs that you can get is look at Johnny Seed, and it's a wealth of information on almost everything you want to grow. Okay, at this point, I'll turn it back to Brandon, and we can go through questions and answers, and I'll do the best I can in the time frame that we have available to us.
Thank you very much, John. That was a fantastic run through, very thorough for the half an hour here. And we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us here today. I'll just give another plug for this being a fantastic hobby. It's something I've been doing for quite a while now, and I learned quite a few tips today that I think is going to make this year's planting even more successful. So I hope everybody was able to get quite a bit out of this. And obviously, you know, this is a sustainability webinar series, and you touched on it there at the end. Some of the big benefits here are, you know, growing our own food locally means that it's not being shipped long distances, so you're not having the greenhouse gas emissions. You know, when we're talking about, you know, trying to reduce single-use plastic packaging, if you're growing your own food and picking it from the garden, it's not coming in plastic packaging from the grocery store. So there's numerous sustainability benefits from this hobby that I think are fantastic. So a couple questions. If you do have more questions, type them into the chat box here. I'll start sending them your way. The first one here is, have you seen any impact of climate change on planting times in terms of earlier dates for the last frost or later dates for the last frost?
There's and I don't have it off the top of my head, but there's a website that you can get to that has the last frost and first frost of every year for the last 50 or 60 years. And it also is dependent upon where you are in the state, and it records that. And I wish I could have that link available to you, but you can search around for it. And you can see a increase in what they call grow time. Specifically over the last 20 years, it's increased by, I'd say, 7 or 8 days from the first frost in the spring to the last frost in the fall. That might not seem like much, but 7 or 8 days is increased grow time between frosts. Now, some vegetables you can put in before your first frost, and some you can put in and will still survive after the first frost. So the increase in 7 or 8 days gives you an extra time for your production of your vegetables. And some of the stuff like carrots, you can leave in the ground well into your first frost because they'll only get sweeter as you go. So that helps you say, okay, I want to plant some carrots. They'll germinate in 30 days, and they'll be full growth for picking in 60 days. And maybe my first frost is middle of October. I can still harvest these in November. So it still allows you to plant some in that time frame. So yes, I have noticed an increase in growing days due to climate change.
Mm-hmm. Another question here, we've gotten a couple iterations of it, is what is the best way to protect your garden from chipmunks, squirrels, deer, any number of vermin, if you will?
Okay, so chipmunks are very hard. The best thing is fences from the deer. As far as the chipmunks go, raised beds of about 8 inches or higher will work very nicely. Your moles will bury under that. So when you make your raised beds, you can put chicken wire down 4 or 5 inches below the ground to prevent them from doing that. Rabbits won't get over 8 to 10 inches of raised beds, so you don't necessarily need to fence those in. Squirrels, there's not a lot you can do about squirrels except plant stuff that they're not going to really eat. and you can find that by saying what crops they do not like. Um, and I found that the squirrels will leave a lot of things alone. Like I planted garlic around my tomatoes, so they don't really come to that, or they'll come later in the season. And if you have your plum tomatoes that are low to the ground, they'll bite one and they'll decide they don't like the tomatoes and they'll move on. So there's no clean way of doing it, but there are techniques you can use as to what you plant, how you plant your gardens, how you protect your gardens. Like I said, ground burrowing, you can put your chicken wire below your raised beds. You make your raised bed high enough, the rabbits aren't going to get into it, and the chipmunks won't climb it. The deer you protect with fences. If you use some of this stuff that says where you put it down, it's supposed to be to repel all. That works really well until your first rainfall. So if you put it down and then it rain, you got to put it down again. So it's the other thing is that you can find some herbs and flowers that have scents that detract from the vegetables, and that comes in our companion planting presentation, where it tells you can plant things that will repel other um, animals and also attract pollinators, which are very important for your garden growth.
Yep. Yeah, I remember my grandparents used to put onions around the outside of the garden, and that kind of acted as a fence. They knew that the squirrels didn't like those, so yeah, some of that you can find out what you want to use. So what is the best soil mix to start seedlings indoors?
Okay, so you don't want to use the outdoor soil, and your potting soil may or may not be the best. There is, if you're starting your seedlings, there's a special seedling soil that you can get that you best get from your garden centers, not your big box stores, but your garden centers that will grow, and places that provide you the necessary tools. You go to some of the garden centers, and I know particularly here in the Albany area, there's a Gates Farm, and they provide you with all of the necessary equipment, including the soil. But there's a lot of tricks to growing indoors, as far as you want to have your moisture underneath your packet. So you need your heat lamps, you need your heat pads on the bottom. You want to put your water in a tray that so you're watering it from the bottom. You don't have to water it from the top. And it doesn't take a lot of soil to help your plant grow, but the little packets that they give you to grow your plants in, you want to fill them completely with your soil. So there's it's not your regular soil, it's not your potting soil. There's a separate soil that's got a little bit of a mixture that I don't remember off the top of my head to mix with that. But you want to make sure that you have enough soil in your little grow pot that when you transplant your plant outside, that there's enough that the roots will propagate through it.
Yep. And very specific question here. Somebody has had issues with land snails invading the gardens. Even the raised beds were not immune to them. Do you have any recommendations for what to do about land snails?
Um, I think the land snails can be treated like slugs. If you have like there's a number of things you can get what they call the beer treatment, where they have little small pots that you can or flat saucers that you put the beer in, and the slugs and the will propagate to that, and then you can kill them. Again, there are tricks to that that I don't have off the top of my head, but I can do the research and I can send it to you, Brandon, and you can forward to those people that are interested in it. But the land snails can be treated like slugs as far as repelling them from certain parts of your garden.
Yeah, sounds good. We've got a couple questions about specific vegetables here.
Okay.
First one is carrots. Any
Yes.
tips to growing carrots? This person asks if maybe they're too impatient.
Yes. Carrots take a long time. I found when you're planting carrots, the the seeds are very small, and again, when you spread them out, you have to make sure that when they grow, you have to clip them. Carrots take a long time. If you look at a seed packet, it tells you that somewhere is about 60 days to growth. The longer you leave your carrots in, the better off you are. The thing that I found with my carrots, the best I use is something called a seed tape. You can purchase a seed tape or you can make your own seed tape. And make your own seed tape, you just take the seeds, a little bit of toilet paper, and you put the seeds in the toilet paper, fold the toilet paper over, and just seal it with a little bit of moisture or soap. And then when you plant it, this way you control your spacing. You can control your depth a little easier by trying to shake out the seeds out of a seed packet. It becomes very difficult, and you end up overplanting, and you waste a lot. So you look at the back of the seed packet, and depending upon the type of carrot that you wish to grow, your germination may take 14 days, and your growth to fruition may be anywhere from 60 to 75. And that's where your seed catalogs come in handy because they'll tell you the type of carrot, the germination time, and the amount of time to produce what you can pick your carrots. And surprisingly, you can get carrots anywhere from 56 days all the way up to 80 days, depending upon the type you get. So you may be impatient with when you want your carrots. And this goes back to when you can start planting them and when you can put them in the ground.
Yep, and the next question is on cucumbers. What's the best time to plant them and get good results?
Again, cucumbers require a little bit of warm soil around 50 degrees and things. A trick I have found, and I've used this with my neighbor who loves cucumbers. I don't particularly grow them because I don't have enough space for them. Is you grow them up a trellis, and because they like to run, and whatever kind of cucumber you want to grow, whether you want to grow the pickling or the regular slicing cucumber, what you do is when you plant them, you put a trellis behind them, and once they start to grow, you train them to go up the trellis. And two things happen with that. One, it gives you more space in your garden if you have limited space. And the other is what happens is your cucumber itself hangs down as it grows up the trellises. And that prevents them from getting the little off-center white spot. If you go buy a cucumber in the supermarket and you rotate it, you just find that there's a white spot somewhere on around the circumference of it. And that's where it sat on the ground the whole time that it grew to fruition. If you're growing up a trellis and a hang down, you don't get that. So you don't have any distinction or a tilting per se of the cucumber on the internal part of it.
I am definitely doing that this summer. That is a good tip. I'm glad that person asked that question. Another one here on sweet corn. Any tips for sweet corn?
Oh God. Um, yes, don't grow it unless you have a large amount of property. You need at least 20 stalks of corn to get any kind of measurable crop, and you'll only get one or two on those. Um, the reason being is you need a large number of plants to be able to pollinate the corn. And corn is one of those things that I kind of tell people, unless you have a really large space to grow your corn in, and it's very limited in its growth and it takes a long time to grow, I don't recommend it for you. Just because it takes a large number of stalks to get any kind of ears, that you have any kind of production.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And folks, I'm just going to say right now, we have a ton of questions in here, so we'll get to as many as we can. We've probably got another 5 minutes or so.
Brandon, let me
Yeah,
interrupt you. If you have people send you those questions and then you send them on to me, I will do
Mhm.
my best to answer them all and put them in my Q&A and send them back to everybody, because I'm sure that some of the questions that people have, other people hadn't thought to ask but wish they had. And this way we can take care of that. It may take me a week or two to do that, but I think it'd be beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So if you do have questions, type them into the box here and we will get those over to John. Couple final ones here. What do you suggest to prevent tomato blight?
Oh, that's hard because again, if you go to the Cornell Cooperative Extension website and you look at tomatoes, they tell you the different types of tomatoes you can plant that are blight resistant. Again, blight is a combination of the genetics of the tomato you plant and the weather conditions and the nutrients that are in your soil. So you got to be very careful about what you plant and what happens with the tomatoes. And if you get a blight, a couple of years ago, we had a blight up in this area that covered 80% of the tomatoes because everybody bought their tomatoes from a big box store and they all came from down south and they all had a disease in them. So again, you got to be careful about where you get your plants from and your growing conditions. One note on tomatoes that I always got my people complain, my tomatoes split. It's growing very well and split. What happens there is if you have a rainy day or a couple of days of rain, the tomatoes love the water and they'll suck them up. Then if you get a hot day after that, they want to expand, the skin cracks. So if you have a number of rainy days and you know you're having warm weather after that, pick the tomatoes that you want. You can ripen them in brown paper bags on your countertop. Otherwise, you're going to get split tomatoes and then you run the risk of having diseases get into them or they don't look good and you decide not to eat them. If you're going to do that, then you take those and those turn into your sauce.
That is fantastic and good to know. One last question here that we'll get to. Any tips for establishing an asparagus bed?
Yes, you want to make sure that you have an asparagus bed that is separate from every place else. And you have to be very patient because those are the things that will grow year after year after year, and they'll expand year after year after year, and they'll take over your garden if you let them. You have to be very patient because the first year you plant them, you may not get asparagus. Usually they're a second year crop, and once you get the second year crop, then they'll grow after that, and they'll go from the roots down below, and they'll take over the whole land. We had an asparagus crop or a bed dedicated solely to asparagus out in on the Cornell Cooperative Extension Master Gardener Gardens. And after a number of years, we had to just dig it all up because they were getting so prolific and they started to spread outside their bed. So again, this is a patient crop. You don't expect them to come the right away the first year. You may get the second year, you may get enough for a meal. Your third year, you'll get a few meals. Your fourth year, you'll start to have more asparagus than you could possibly want, and hope your neighbors like asparagus.
That is really good to know. So yeah, with that, I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. I want to thank you for all the thoughtful questions as well. A big thank you to John for taking the time here today to do this, and especially for being able to look at the questions afterwards. We're going to save all the questions that came in that weren't answered today, get them over to John, and we'll be sending that out afterwards along with the notes as well in the bibliography. So you'll have all.
There was one question that I'd like to address.
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
in the chat. It talked about the invasive Japanese knotweed, and
Oh, yeah, go
yes,
for it.
the root system is massive, and it's one of those things that you can't get rid of right away. What you have to do is cut it down every place you have, including the problem is it may be in your neighbor's yard too, and you have to dig it out, and it's still going to propagate, and it takes about 2 or 3 years of digging, cutting, chopping. As soon as it starts to come up, you cut it down, and then you have to dig it up as much as you can. And if it's running from your neighbor's yards, then you're going to have to get your neighbors to deal with it. And yes, the system is massive, and it's an invasive plant. You're right, and it's so difficult. You can cut them down, but they're still going to keep coming back. So I guess that doesn't help you that much. The problem with it in the other plants is that because it takes up so much nutrient in your soil, you're probably better off planting shallow plants, lettuces, greens, radishes, things that don't require a massive root system or go deep. I sympathize with you because the Japanese knotweed is a difficult problem, and it's rapidly getting worse. When I have farmers markets that we do tables at, I get that the Japanese knotweed question a lot. We also have the question about bamboo. People think, oh, I'm going to plant a bamboo plant. Well, that's the worst thing you can do because bamboo is also an invasive plant that will spread like crazy and take over your yard. So those are two things you gotta work hard to get rid of, and it takes a long time.
Really good information. So yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for everything, John. As I mentioned, we'll send out the materials afterwards. And our next edition of the webinar is going to be on May 10th, and that's on the Climate Smart Communities program. So thanks a lot, everyone.
And Brandon, I mentioned to you the other options for presentation. So if you choose to have any of those, just let Carol know and we can work through that.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks for letting me participate.